Okay, we're going to get started in a minute. Happy Thursday, everyone. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Time to study a little Talmud. So good afternoon. I hope you have all had a nice Pesach. For me, I feel like this year's Pesach just flew by. Even though we're stuck at home, maybe it's because I didn't have the option of being distracted by outside food, but it was really easy and it went by really quickly. So I'm hoping that maybe that is something that will continue in future years, because sometimes it can feel laborious. But this year, Passover has not felt laborious, despite the fact that it was raining for the majority of the holiday. Now the sun is out. It's a beautiful day. So today we continue and we will conclude the story of the Oven of Akhnai. So before we do a little bit of review of last week and get into part 2, let's of course do our blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Let's do it. Just a reminder of Zoom etiquette / options. You will know that in the middle of the bottom of your screen, you have the chat function and the Q&A function. So as we're going through the story and you have questions, you can click on the Q&A tab, type in your question, and then we can review it either at that time and when it pops up, or later on towards the end of our session together. And also there's the chat function, so you can chat me privately with your question, and then I can attempt to answer that as well. You also have the option of raising your hand, and that way there's the opportunity for us to hear your question or your comment, because sometimes people have comments, not just questions. It is a Jewish gathering, of course. And at that time, once you raise your hand, I can call on you, so to speak, and unmute you, and you can share your perspective or your question with us. Okay? Let's get to it. A little review of last week before we get into this week. If you have the source sheet with you, great. You don't need it if you don't have it from last week. But reminder, just a quick overview of the beginning of this story. This story is focusing on a rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer. Eliezer ben Hyrcanos is his full name. And Rabbi Eliezer comes to the Sanhedrin, the group of rabbis, and he brings an argument to suggest that a certain type of oven is actually legitimate, and that they should accept that the things that go into that oven are not susceptible to being unclean. Okay, and he brings all of these declarations and all of these ideas to prove his point that the things that go into this oven are not susceptible to being unclean. In other words, they're not going to become impure. No one agrees with him. So then a carob tree, and then the stream of water, and then the walls of the Beit Midrash, the house of study, start to fall. And finally, a voice from God, a bat kol, comes out and declares, Rabbi Eliezer is correct in every single point. However, that is not enough to convince them. And all of the rabbis and the group say, sorry, but lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven. The Torah is not in heaven. The Torah is up to us to determine how we are going to interpret this text. Therefore, sorry, buddy, but we have to go with the majority. The majority we are inclined to the majority perspective. And then God says, when a guy is asking, well, what did God do when they said, well, sorry, God, we're not listening to you? God laughs and says, my children have defeated me. And last week we had a variety of interpretations about this story, this part 1 of the story. But now I want to get to part 2, because there were some allusions in last week's conversation to, well, what about the relationships here? Last week we focused more so on God and God's response, and this idea of how do we understand our role in interpreting Torah, that this text seems to suggest that we have ownership over how we interpret Torah. But now let's get to the continuation of the story, part 2. So you should have that source sheet. And as we do every single week, I'm going to share my screen and you will see the text and we will read through it and then we'll go back and break it down. Okay? Sound good? Great. Here we go. Continuation of Babylonian Talmud, Baba Metzia 59b. Okay, the part 1 ended with God saying, they defeated me. Okay, my children have defeated me. They said, on that day, they brought all of the objects that Rabbi Eliezer had declared insusceptible to uncleanness and burned them in fire, as though they were unclean beyond all purification. They furthermore took a vote against him and cursed him. They said, who will go and inform him? Said to them, Rabbi Akiva, I shall go and tell him, lest someone unworthy go and tell him and he turn out to destroy the entire world with his curse. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He put on black garments and cloaked himself in a black cloak and took his seat before him at a distance of 4 cubits. Said to him Rabbi Eliezer, Akiva, why is today different from all other days? Appropriate that we're reading this during Passover. He said to him, my lord, it appears to me that your colleagues are keeping distance from you. Then he too tore his garments and removed his shoes, moved his stool and sat down on the ground with tears streaming from his eyes. The world was blighted. 1/3 olives, 1/3 wheat, 1/3 barley. And some say also the dough in women's hands swelled up. A Tanaite authority taught there was a great disaster that day, for every place upon which Rabbi Eliezer set his eyes was burned up. And also Rabbi Gamliel was coming by ship. A big wave arose to drown him. He said, it appears to me that this is on account only of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos. He stood upon his feet and said, Lord of the world, it is perfectly obvious to you that it was not for my own honor that I have acted, nor for the honor of the house of my father have I acted, but it was for the honor owing to you specifically, so that dissension should not become rife in Israel. And the sea subsided. Ima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, was the sister of Rabban Gamliel. From that time onward, she never left Rabbi Eliezer to fall on his face in prayer. So great was the power of his prayer that if he were to recite certain prayers because of the injury done him, God would listen and destroy her brother. One day, which was the day of the new moon, she mistook, assuming that the month was a defective one, and others say she was distracted by a poor man who came and stood at her door and to whom she took out a piece of bread. She found that her husband had fallen on his face, and she said to him, get up, for you have killed my brother. Meanwhile, the word came from the house of Rabban Gamliel that he had died. He said to her, then how did you know? She said to him, so do I have as a tradition from the household of the father of my father. All gates are locked, except for the gates of wounded feelings. The end of the story. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we are going to go and break the story down. Okay, remember our point in studying this and in how we interpret this, of course, is to try and, number one, understand what is the lesson or lessons being taught. And number two, what I like to also try and do is what is the relevance to our lives today? This is the same with Torah study. I think Talmud study is no different. And I think there are always some key elements that we can incorporate into our lives today and that are relevant to what we're going through. Okay, so we're going to break it down and go piece by piece again. And again, if you have any questions or you need clarification on anything, you can either raise your hand or add your question to the Q&A place. Okay, so let's go back to this. Oh, wrong one. You don't need to see that. We already know it started. Hold on. Let me get the right one. Here we go. Okay, back to the beginning. They said, okay, so now we're talking about all those rabbis from the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic court, all the ones who at the beginning of the story last week had disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer. On that day, on the day being the one where they had agreed that the Torah is not in heaven, they brought all of the objects that Rabbi Eliezer had declared insusceptible to uncleanness and burned them in a fire as though they were unclean beyond all purification. Okay, they are taking all of his work. They are taking all of the theses that he has ever declared, all of the interpretations of Torah that he had made at some point during his time as a rabbi in the Sanhedrin. Anything that he had said was insusceptible to uncleanness. In other words, not just things related to this specific argument that he had made about this oven, but anything that he had declared insusceptible to uncleanness at any point in any of the arguments that they had over the course of years in the house of study, and they destroyed all of them, so as though they were unclean beyond all purification. All right, in other words, completely destroyed all of the work that he had done, okay, negating all of it. And they furthermore took a vote against him and cursed him. Okay, and this is a big deal also, because they are basically saying, not only are we destroying everything that you have worked and declared based on your interpretation of the Torah and of the Mishnah, but we are also stepping away from you. You are now cursed. In other words, you're no longer included in our group. Okay. And so they said, so who's going to go and inform him? Because he's not here, by the way. He's not there when this vote is taken, that they are declaring that he is no longer a part of the group. Who's going to go and inform him? Said them Rabbi Akiba. Rabbi Akiba, who was very famous, was Rabbi Eliezer's student. Okay. And Rabbi Eliezer's student, Rabbi Akiba, says, I shall go and tell him, lest someone unworthy go and tell him and he turn out to destroy the entire world with his curse. Okay, so Rabbi Akiba says, as his student, as the demeanor with which I will come and my relationship with him is worthy enough that I should be the one to go and tell him, because I'm going to be able to give him this news in a way that maybe he won't get so upset that he'll destroy the world. Okay, and I also want to remind you, we had another story weeks ago that we talked about another rabbi who went into a cave, if you remember, in the story about the cave, and you can find all the source sheets and past videos of all of these sessions online on our website. So you can go back and review, or if you weren't a part of that one, you can go and find it. There was another story about a rabbi who came out of a cave and also had the power to destroy the entire world with his eyes. Okay, so there's a theme here. So Rabbi Akiva is going to go to make sure that Rabbi Eliezer doesn't destroy the whole world when he hears this news that they've destroyed all of the objects that he's made a teaching on, and when he finds out that he is ostracized from the community. So what did Rabbi Akiva do? He put on black garments and cloaked himself in a black cloak and took his seat before him at a distance of 4 cubits. Okay, this is traditionally what was done both for mourning, and that when you are mourning something, and also when someone was cursed and ostracized from the community, you had to stay a distance of 4 cubits. Okay, said to him, so Rabbi Eliezer says to him, Akiba, why is today different from all other days? In other words, why are you coming to me like this? And why are you dressed that way? And why are you sitting? What's different about today? But I also think that's a nice connection to Manish Tana. Why is this night different than all other nights? And Akiba said to him, my Lord, it appears to me that your colleagues are keeping distance from you, right? Which is a very nice way of saying you are ostracized, because in fact, it's more than just keeping a distance, right? He's basically telling Eliezer that you are now ostracized from the community. You are cursed, and you are no longer a part of our community. Then he too, meaning Rabbi Eliezer, tore his garments and removed his shoes as if he was in mourning, moved his stool and sat down on the ground with tears streaming from his eyes. Of course, you could understand that kind of reaction after you've dedicated your entire life to being a part of a group of people who spend their time trying to make the world better through the lessons of Torah, and spend their days figuring out what is God's interpretation how are we supposed to interpret God's teachings from the Torah. Okay, so now he's being told he can't do any of that. his entire life is being turned upside down. And so the response, the world was blighted, a third olives, a third wheat, a third of the world's barley. And some also say that even the dough in women's hands kind of swelled up, right? That even though Rabbi Akiba was able to come to Rabbi Eliezer and kind of give him the news in as nice a way as possible, there was still destruction that came from that. That Rabbi Eliezer's pain was still deep enough, even in its subsided way. That's not correct grammar, I don't think, but even though he subsided from his complete power, even so, a third of all of the world's crops were destroyed. Okay. I also think it's really interesting earlier, this idea of the distance, the physical distance. Right now, we are definitely in a time of physical distance, right? And there are times where physical distance is used, obviously, as of now, to keep us safe. But physical distance, what we have to be very careful of is that physical distance becomes something that we get so used to that it becomes the norm, right? That somehow getting close to another person down the road will be a negative thing. And so we just have to always be aware of that. Okay, a Tannaite authority taught, but there was a great disaster that day. For every place upon which Rabbi Eliezer set his eyes was burned up. Okay, and that also kind of alludes to that other story I referred to, called the cave, right? So some are saying that it was so disastrous that actually everywhere that Rabbi Eliezer turned, the world burned up in front of his eyes. Okay, so this news really was destructive, not just to the world, but it was destructive to the world because it was destructive to Rabbi Eliezer. And also Rabbi Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin. Okay, he was the rabbi of the rabbis. He was in charge. So the decisions that were made by the Sanhedrin, really, at the end of the day, he's at the top. Okay, so he was coming by a ship, and a big wave arose to drown him. And he said, "It appears to me that this is on account only of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos." He was aware that Eliezer had so much power that only this kind of wave would be the result of Rabbi Eliezer's response to Rabbi Gamliel and the rest of the Sanhedrin saying, "You are no longer a part of our community, you are ostracized." But Rabban Gamliel appeals to God, and he stands up on his feet and he says, "Lord, it is perfectly obvious to you that it wasn't for my own honor that I acted. I didn't make this decision for my own good or for the honor of the house of my father. Now, I only did this to honor you. I ostracized Rabbi Eliezer from the community because I was protecting you. And I was protecting you so that dissension should not become rife in Israel." And the sea subsided. In other words, I am trying to protect the Jewish people. This is Rabban Gamliel's statement. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with this, but this is the statement that's coming through with Rabbi Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is saying, in order for us to protect the Jewish people, there can't be dissension like this. This is not okay. You can't have someone like Rabbi Eliezer in part one of our story, who is willing to pick up carob trees and use mystical, magical elements of the world in order to prove a point. That is not the way it can be done. The majority has to rule. And if we don't play by those rules, there's going to be dissension. Now, this is a little bit of a response to another Talmudic story, which maybe we'll study at some point in the near future, the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. You may have heard of this story before. It's a story about how a relationship between two people leads to the destruction of the temple. And it's one of the Talmudic responses given as to why the second temple was destroyed in the year 70, that it was due to sinat chinam, it was due to hatred of one another. That senseless or baseless hatred of another was what led to the destruction of the temple and kind of a whole recreation of Jewish history and Jewish identity. So that senseless hatred and dissension are things that can tear apart the Jewish community and the Jewish world. Okay, so somehow, for some reason, this argument seems to be supported by God, because God somehow the sea subsides. However, Ima Shalom, mother of peace, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, was the sister of Rabban Gamliel. Okay, so they're all part of the connected family. And from that time onward, from the time that Rabbi Eliezer found out that he was ostracized from the community, she never left Rabbi Eliezer to fall on his face in prayer. Now, what they mean by that is there is a section of the daily prayer service called Tachanun. And Tachanun is a section of the prayer service mostly focused on penitence and supplication, prayers of supplication and penitence. In other words, and literally, usually there are people who kind of put their arm down on the desk, or they go like this, and it's kind of like it's a more contemplative, but also a sense where you say, Al chet shechatanu lefanecha. It's not just on Yom Kippur that we are offering prayers of asking God for forgiveness. So there is this section of a daily service where we are supposed to fall on our face literally in prayer and ask God for certain things. Okay, and so she knew that he was so powerful that if he were to offer those prayers during Tachanun, during the Tachanun section of the prayer service, that he could destroy not only the world, but he could destroy her brother because of vengeance, because of his own feelings, because her brother was the one who oversaw the whole Sanhedrin and basically is the one who is responsible for making this decision. Okay, on one day, which was the day of the new moon, Rosh Chodesh, she mistook, assuming that the month was a defective one. In other words, Rosh Chodesh happens when there's a new moon, and based on the lunar cycle, a Jewish calendar month, is either 30 days or 29 days. And some months are 29 days and some are 30 days. It goes back to this whole idea back in the day where witnesses would have to come to the Sanhedrin and say they saw the new moon or saw the crescent, and therefore that would be declared time of the new month, right? So she got it wrong. She misinterpreted. It was a 30-day month instead of a 29-day month. And so therefore and because those prayers of supplication are not done on Rosh Chodesh, she assumed that he wasn't going to be offering those prayers that day. So she was okay. Or others say that wasn't actually what happened. Actually, she was distracted by a poor man who came and stood at her door and to whom she took out a piece of bread. Right? Because, and I think this is a strong statement about Ima Shalom, mother of peace, that not only did she want peace in her home, but the responsibility to care for the poor. And especially as we think about those long lines that are out there in cities across our country right now, people who are lining up for food pantry items. I mean, cars that are miles long, literally. That it took precedent for her to go out and care for this poor person and to leave her husband for a moment so that she could bring out a piece of bread to this poor person. But regardless of what happened, she came back and she found out that he was actually offering those prayers, that he had fallen on his face in the Tachanun prayers. And she said, "Get up, you have killed my brother." And meanwhile, at the same time, right, or soon right around then, word came from the house of Rabban Gamliel that he had died. And so Rabbi Eliezer said to his wife, "How did you know that? How did you know that your brother was dead?" And she said, "So do I have as a tradition from the household of the father of my father. All gates are locked except for the gates of wounded feelings." All gates are locked except for the gates of wounded feelings. And that's where the story ends. The impact of Rabban Gamliel's decision, the impact of Rabbi Eliezer's cohort of all of his rabbinic colleagues, the impact of their decisions and how they treated him were so great that not only did he destroy a third of the world's harvest, but it led to the death of his teacher and the death of the head of the Sanhedrin. Right? A really, really strong statement about the impact of how we treat those who have a dissenting opinion, right? That Rabbi Eliezer, this is where we start to get into the variety of interpretations of the story, which is why I love these stories, right? That Rabbi Eliezer, he was very firm in his position. And earlier on last week, we saw that he was even willing to maybe bring some destruction to the people in order to maintain his position. But regardless, there is no excuse, according to one way you can read this story, there is no excuse for treating the dissenter as an ostracized human who is cursed. And by doing so, we lead to the destruction of an entire system, right? This is not so in line with what we're talking about, but it's just coming to my head now. My wife told me the other day that she read that this March was the first time in over a decade that there wasn't a school shooting, right? Because of what we're experiencing with staying at home, March was the first March in over a decade, and I don't remember what the exact statistic was, since there was a school shooting in the month of March, right? That's incredible to me. Now, the reason I bring that up is because school shootings, we tend to see that the shooter is someone who has felt ostracized, who is alone, right? I think it's not directly parallel to the story, but the idea that those who are ostracized and feel outside tend to be the ones, or have the capacity to be the ones, who bring destruction, not just upon themselves, but on many others, some of whom are innocent, is something that we do need to be aware of in today's world. And in this story in particular, the way in which we treat someone who in this case is our friend or our teacher or someone with whom we have a relationship, that if they have a dissenting opinion and we decide, you know what, we're no longer going to be friends on Facebook, or I am cutting you out of my life entirely, that is not what our tradition is saying we should do at all. That ona'at devarim, the prohibition against verbal oppression, is an important value. Ona'at devarim, the prohibition against verbal oppression. Now, there are plenty of examples out there where we are seeing from leadership in our country and around the world of people using verbal oppression, right? And our tradition is saying that is a destructive behavior that we should not model. We should not mirror that behavior. And if anything, we need to fight very hard against it because it is destructive in ways that we can't even imagine. So at a time where we are feeling more distant, physically distant, just like I'm thinking about Rabbi Akiva, who is sitting a physical distance away from his teacher, giving him bad news. At this time where we are feeling physically distant, and at a time whereas the longer we are in these safer at home, in the safer at home bubble, we are going to get used to certain things about being away from other people, about being distant, right? And it can feed in to certain cultural tendencies that have been coming up lately that also are saying, stay away, not just from one another, but stay away from ideas that are different from yours, right? And we're going to be coming into an election cycle soon. And it's going to be fascinating to see what that looks like in this setting. But this is a really important story about the impact of the way in which we treat the dissenting opinion. That, I think, is one of the glosses of how we're supposed to read this story. There are a lot of intricacies that we can find as well. And I'm curious if people want to add their own interpretations, their own thoughts about any element of the story, either based on how this is a continuation from last week, and whether that has shifted your perspective on last week's part one. If there are certain pieces of this story that you want to delve into, or you have a question, or you disagree with my opinion, and therefore you have a dissenting opinion, I will not ostracize you or cut you off. But I do think that we have the character of Rabbi Akiva, we have the character of Rabban Gamliel, we have the character, of course, of Rabbi Eliezer, we have his wife. There are many people who play different roles. Rabbi Akiva seems to be the one who is trying to give someone news in a way that's as supportive as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when we give news to someone that's bad or disheartening, that we should expect that they're going to have the kind of reaction that we would hope, right? That there is still a pain that can be felt so deep within the other person that it may manifest itself not necessarily directly to us, but it can come out in different ways, right? It's yet again a teaching that our impact on others through our words or through our actions, and I know it seems so simplistic, but it's simplistic in the sense that it is so important, that our words or our actions have such an impact that they can create or destroy, right? And I just want to remind you, the world is created with words, right? Let there be light. God creates the world with words. And to me, that is one of the most important teachings of the creation story, is that in today's world, the relevance to our life of the idea that God created the world with words is that our words have a power beyond that which we can even imagine. Okay, I see that there is something here. This just makes so much sense, especially now where people are attacking one another because of differences of opinion or their own personal anger. Absolutely, right? And I think we're going to be seeing, Trump is giving a press conference today where he's supposed to outline his plan for how states on their own are going to be coming out of the safer at home. And he alluded to a couple days ago about the idea that there are 20 states that he thinks who may be able and willing to stop safer at home orders even before May 1st. We're going to get, and I actually saw today for the first time a political ad for Joe Biden on TV. That's starting. So we're going to start to see, and right, yesterday in Michigan, there were protests outside the Capitol. People protesting the safer at home orders and the fact that everyone was supposed to wear a mask and some of the restrictions that the governor of Michigan had put in place. We're starting to feel that unrest, and it makes sense. We've been doing this for over a month. And so even more so, because we're going to be getting into more and more disagreement coming up, I think, in the coming weeks as a society. And individually, how are we going to deal with that? Are we going to shut out those who have a dissenting opinion from us? Are we going to try and understand or at least engage in some kind of conversation with those other people? I found that there was a Jewish educator and Jewish scholar named Dr. Michael Kay, who coined a term, interactional pluralism. Interactional pluralism. And the idea of interactional pluralism is that exposure to and relationships with those with whom we disagree or have a dissenting opinion, that those relationships and that exposure leads to a deepening of one's Jewish identity and a furthering development of their Jewish values. So that interactional pluralism, this idea that putting ourselves into relationships and into conversations with those with whom we disagree is actually something that not only sustains us, but deepens our connection to our tradition, that deepens our connection to our own values. Just like the idea that one way in which we understand God and explain God is by describing what God is not, right? That by comparing ourselves to a position or an argument with which we disagree, we have the opportunity to strengthen our own perspective, right? And we are almost put in a position where we have to be able to articulate our position instead of just saying, well, I just disagree, and therefore there's no conversation about it. This is a time where I think we have to dig deep into really working on how do we want to articulate our values and what matters to us. Because that's going to be shaping, I think, the coming months in our society and our country for sure. And then I think individually, how we're going to continue to develop our own understanding of what does it mean to live in this isolation. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Question here from Esther. Not really a question, but more worry about the power differential when it is coupled with the power of words. Feels scary, trying to understand what power we have as individuals. Okay, good question. And actually, Esther, if you don't mind, I'm going to allow you to talk. Can you elaborate on that a little so I can make sure I understand what you're referring to?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So I think I was just trying to process the pieces of the story where Eliezer has this power, this power to be destructive. And, he just is convinced that he's right. And so it had me kind of thinking about, less positive examples, fanatics, people who destroy and are convinced that they are correct in what they're thinking and what they're trying to do. And I'm trying to understand what could come from that, or how, what is our role? How can we make sense of it? When things like that happen, which maybe we can, maybe we can't. I don't know. And then just thinking about like the administration and officials now, and it's just such a different world, obviously, from the story, and just trying to understand, beyond our conversations with each other, how to feel like there's some hope and power that we might have in this situation. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I don't know if I'll be able to fully answer that, because I think you're right. It's partly a comment and a question, but I think, one thing that I take from the story is that there is the tendency in certain people to be fanatical, right? Rabbi Eliezer didn't start out in the conversation with his colleagues in a fanatical way. He didn't come straight out and say in the beginning of the story last week, I'm going to prove to you that my position is correct, and I'm going to prove to you. He didn't go straight to the voice from God, right? There was a buildup of animosity and of frustration and of not feeling heard, and feeling as though his points, as valid as they were, or as valid as he thought they were, that no one was listening to him, to the point where, the voice of God had to come out. And then, even then, when they say, sorry, you're wrong, then the rest of his colleagues went even further. They didn't just say, okay, the conversation's over. They basically tried to destroy his entire identity and to negate anything related to him, right? So they are continually, the rabbis are critiquing themselves, I think, with this story. They're continually taking more and more away from this rabbi's identity, to the point where they say, we want you to be invisible. And I think that's one of the most important lessons here. When people feel invisible, they want to find a way to be seen or to be heard, right? Because we all want to feel seen and heard. And when you feel invisible, some people are going to cry out in a loving way, but some people are going to lash out and say, you don't want to see me? Oh, I'm sure as hell going to make sure you see me. And so I think there's a lesson here about the way in which we go through a process of disagreement, even when we are right, maybe, and the other person is wrong, or even if their position is so wacky, we can't even imagine where they're coming from, that there are many ways in which you can go through a process where you can disagree and step away without leading to destruction. But when people feel invisible, that's when destruction can occur. That's my take from that. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Esther.
No, I mean, I'm in agreement with you, and it's very unsettling. And I guess my tendency is to think, well, but we talked about it last week. There was a point you made about saying that Rabbi Eliezer was right. He was right. And that all of these things that were happening supported his position. And so there's a part of me that feels like that's really unjust. And so it's less about, I hear you about the conversation, but it's also, does it matter if someone is right, or does it just matter who's in the minority and who's in the majority? So these are things that I'm just thinking of. So I appreciate your
thank you.
thoughts on it.
And like many of these stories, they don't always end with wonderful lessons that we can all just walk away hopeful from. But I think you're definitely asking the right questions. Susan Ehrlich, would you talk about Ima Shalom and the resonance of her statement that all gates of heaven are locked except for the gates of wounded feelings? Sure. So the idea that do you want to add to that, Susan, before I answer? You can talk now if you want. No? Oh, hello?
Hello?
Hi.
Did I get it?
Yes.
The gates assume of heaven, of getting into heaven, are locked except for the gates of wounded feelings. So is it that God is more sympathetic and lets people into heaven if they have been hurt? So would Eliezer, I don't know whether Eliezer qualifies or Gamliel because he was hurt too. Discuss that.
Yeah, so I think here it's referring more to prayers being answered, not necessarily when someone dies, whether or not they're going to be accepted into heaven, but that the prayers of someone who is in pain are heard in a way that others are not, right? So that there's a power of wounded feelings have such a power. In other words, the way we treat people is really important, because when we hurt people's feelings, their prayers, whether those are prayers of a positive, like, please give me the strength to get through this in a positive way and to keep my cool, or if their prayer is, please destroy the person who made me feel bad, that there's no discretion from God's perspective on which of those prayers gets through the barrier, so that both of those prayers are getting through, that the prayers of the wounded are more powerful than any other person's prayers. Now we can expand that, we can focus that on it from a negative perspective, or we can see that there are so many prayers out there of people who are in desperate pain, and God, please answer their prayers so that they can find some fulfillment, some health, whatever it may be. But I think that the message of this story seems to be, from that statement alone, that when someone is wounded, their prayers are going to be answered. So be careful your role in hurting someone else, because you don't know what kind of prayer they're going to pray for.
Isn't some of the converse, I mean, also the prayer is most powerful for the person who has been wounded. You know, like there are no atheists in a foxhole.
Yes.
Or in a hospital. So their prayers are stronger. But she's saying that their prayers may be heard as well because they're stronger. There's intention there, the kavanah.
Yeah. Yeah, the kavanah, the intention of those prayers is more powerful. So that's why I think it's also one of these things that we can see as a hopeful message, that when you are feeling wounded, when you are feeling pain, that maybe God is going to hear your prayer or answer your prayer. Now, that's a certain theology, and I don't know how many people in the modern world hold on to that theology, that God necessarily answers prayers in exactly the way we ask them. But it is a theology that has existed in our tradition for a long time. And so I think if you have the theology that God answers our prayers, or has the capacity to do that, or acts in that way, then this can be a very hopeful message as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions, insights about this passage? No? Going once? Going twice? Okay. So I think I got to the point. I kind of said it over and over again, that our words are powerful, and they matter. And how we decide to create distance, not just physically, but intellectual and psychological distance from other people, can have significant impacts. And as we move into this next stage of our country's recognition of the impact of coronavirus, and as we start to see what I think is probably going to happen is, and I'm not a poli-sci person, but the fact that we are going to begin to see differences among the states, and differences of opinion about how we should be acting. Because as soon as one state does something, people in another state, let's say Montana decides to open their doors, that does open the door for people in California to say, well, Montana's doing that. And yes, it's different, but doors begin to open up to new perspectives. And there is a yearning. We all have that yearning to go back to normal. So we have to both fight that yearning to go back to normal in order to make sure we can eventually go back to a normal that's as used to what we had before as possible. But if we jump too far in and we're not protecting ourselves and those around us, then it's going to take us even longer to get back to that normal, the way we used to have it. Anyway, just a few thoughts from today. I really appreciate you being here, for engaging in the conversation and learning this story with me. And we'll be back next week with another story. We'll probably do a few more rounds of these. I don't know if you guys want to continue doing this for months at a time, or if we change to something else. So feel free to reach out to me. You have my email at the top of all the source sheets. Let me know what your thoughts are in terms of what's working about this or what's not. And we're always looking for new ways of engaging in Jewish study, and also trying to engage our community in new ways. So again, all of the information of what we're providing is found at wbtla.org, which is our website, /WBT at home. And that's where you can find the links to all the learning that we're doing, the Shabbat services that we're providing, and many more things. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and an early Shabbat Shalom. See you next week. Bye.